Someone doesn't want you to know about Wisconsin. They don't want any of us to know, in fact. I only have this information because I was there on the first day. I was there before they knew what they needed to hide. In the late 2010s, there was a nuclear leak that bled right into the Mississippi River. Before they knew the damages, they had emergency services form a perimeter around the contaminated part of the Mississippi. I was one member of that line. They wanted to contain any potential panic. The leak, according to what they said early on, was contained. There wasn't any radiation in the earth or on the wind. They made it sound safe. It was strange to us, there on the perimeter, when they said those things, and only then began to test the water. They came out with their handheld radiation detectors and various instruments that could be plunged into the waters. They were dressed a lot more safely than we were. That was alarming. We were in our daily uniforms, urging civilians to back away from the area while they were right over our shoulders with hazmat suits. It didn't help our confidence, that was for sure. It did help encourage people to give the emergency dividers a wide berth. Within 2 hours, they were pulling stuff out of the river. They cast a net and were dragging up every type of fish that they could. We didn't know why, and we didn't ask. Every time they did something new, we broke out into another fresh sweat. After the tests and the fishing net, they started to back off. The news reported the same stories, no harmful levels of radiation, nothing to be concerned about. We thought it was strange that a long stretch of the Mississippi became inaccessible to fishermen, but we all figured it was a precautionary measure and not a response. I think they're letting them back now, I'm not sure. Maybe they realized it was too late. Maybe they've gotten so good at burying the harmful stories that they don't care how many crop up. The real issue wasn't the fish, it was the people. The first responders who were present that day all started to get sick. We didn't notice it at first. It wasn't until one of our friends was forced into retirement that we really turned to look at each other. Our bodies were all falling apart. We didn't know if it was due to exposure or bad luck or something else in Wisconsin, but we were determined to find out. We started sneaking back to the Mississippi. We started examining the wildlife there. The reactor had been demolished for months by then. We figured there wouldn't be any additional risks to people in our position. We found horrible things in that water. There weren't tons of them, of course. It turns out that animals can deal with nuclear radiation a lot better than humans. But there were mutations, abnormal growths. We took what we could and tried to pull some strings at Fish and Game. They turned us down. They turned us in, actually. Soon the police were knocking at our doors, writing every fine and citation that they could. They told us it would be worse if we went back. We went back. This time we followed the river until we could safely cut onto the lot of the decommissioned nuclear plant. We wanted to see the reactor for ourselves. We wanted to know for sure if it had been removed or destroyed. Even if we couldn't save ourselves, at least we could relax knowing that the same situation wouldn't happen again in the future. We wanted to know if our friends and our families were safe. We didn't make it to the reactor. In hindsight, of course we didn't. They probably had eyes all over that plant. That doesn't mean we didn't see anything, though. Inside the plant, there were tents set up like medical wards, triage units. We knew right away that we didn't belong. There weren't any reported injuries from inside the plant, not during our accident or during any other. It was clear that something had happened, though. The beds were stained, there were bandages and medical supplies, bags of saline and other fluids scattered all over the floor. They were trying to treat something in there. Someone or something had been hurt. We asked each other if it was possible that there were other mutations, if there could be strange creatures living in the plant even now. With the fish so fresh on our minds, it was easy to imagine. We didn't get our answer. Local police stormed the building. They dragged us out. Back at the police station, we saw a few men in suits barking orders at the locals. FBI, we guessed, but we never had the chance to ask. We expected jail time, prison maybe. We were surprised when all we got was another warning. They sent us home. Slowly but surely, our illness is ensuring that we keep quiet. The fewer of us there are to corroborate the story, the more it seems like the delusions of a sick man or woman. We've been brushed aside by now, dismissed in every possible way. A lot of people still refuse to believe that a nuclear plant shut down in the 80s could have leaked something into the environment. They won't travel there, though. No one will, and no one should. It isn't safe in the Mississippi River, and it isn't safe in Wisconsin. If there was ever a chance of the truth getting out, maybe I could put this to rest. Maybe I wouldn't feel so guilty all the time. Maybe I wouldn't feel this responsibility, urging me to share a story that no one believes. Unfortunately, there is no chance. The truth will never see the light of day. It's going to be buried with me. I'm big into cycling and spend most of my free time training or competing in events. I live in central PA, and most of the competitive events in my area happen during the summer months. So I spend fall and winter staying in shape and getting in as much bike time as possible. My goal this day was to hit a 70-mile round trip in 5 hours. For some cyclists, that's almost a leisurely stroll, but I live in a mountainous area and am riding uphill for a good portion of that time. I left around 11 a.m. and planned to be back just before dark around 5. The first leg of my ride was pleasant, if a little cold. Despite a lot of sharp curves, there isn't much traffic in the area, so I don't have to be overly cautious of cars. The trouble came on my way back. It was around 2:30 p.m. when I turned around to make the trip home. I had lost some time as I had run into a few other cyclists I knew and spent a little time chatting with them. In passing, they mentioned seeing some military vehicles, but I didn't really think much of it, though there weren't any military bases nearby. So, riding a little harder than usual, I started home, hoping to still reach my front door by 5. It didn't take long before I hit a literal roadblock. There was a deep green Humvee stretched across the narrow road and 3 men in camouflage standing around. 2 were holding what looked like rifles and the third was sitting behind the wheel. I was told the road beyond was impassable due to a rock slide and I'd need to take an alternate route. Explaining that I could navigate through on my bike came to no avail, and then I was basically SOL. I know the military responding to such an insignificant incident was odd, but didn't really give it much thought as all my attention was drawn to the fact that the only other route home I knew was going to take me 2 hours out of my way. Passes through the mountains are few and far between, so I turned back around and began my extended ride home. Calling it a road does it more justice than it deserves. It was a single-lane, potholed nightmare, and I always avoided it for just that reason. But it's all I had. Going slower than normal because of the poor road conditions, I began making my way down it. After about 30 minutes, I was beginning to think that maybe it wasn't so bad. The road seemed to have been patched in a few places, and some of the lower-hanging tree limbs had been trimmed. I was slowing down to take a drink of water from my bottle when I caught something from the corner of my eye. It was moving as fast as I, whatever it was. I thought maybe it was a deer or something, but it had more of a loping gait than a deer's prance. Not really concerned, I came to a full stop to try and get a better look. It was behind a thick patch of brush about 30 yards away. It was hard to make out any details, but it was covered in muddied brown fur. Thinking it might be a black bear, I started pedaling again, keeping my eyes on it. Bears nearly never attack people, but I figured it's best not to chance it. Then, it stood up. Its head crested the 7-foot-high patch of bushes. An elongated muzzle, like a wolf, sat in front of a pair of narrow amber eyes. It opened its maw and let out an almost human-like scream. I took off down the road, pumping as fast as my legs would let me. I heard it crash through the forest undergrowth as it leapt out onto the road behind me. Despite being on an uneven road, I had to have been going over 30 miles an hour, and it was keeping up with me. I could hear its padded footsteps coming from behind, and it let out another skin-crawling howl. I've never ridden so hard in my entire life. 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes later, this thing was still behind me. If it wasn't for the pure adrenaline of terror, I would have collapsed already. Anytime I felt the slightest urge to slow, the creature let out another feral scream, and my energy was renewed. At one point, I came to a sharp curve, and one of those blind spot mirrors was mounted along the roadside. It had been knocked out of place and was positioned so I could see what was behind me. It was running on all fours, fangs bared as globs of saliva flew back from its mouth. I glimpsed a foot with several dagger-like claws extending from it. Through the mirror, me and the beast made quick eye contact, and seeing its quarry's face, it let out another human howl, quickened its pace. I was nearing the point of exhaustion and knew that I couldn't keep the pace any longer. Involuntarily beginning to slow, I had mental flashes of being torn to shreds by the creature. Just as it started to catch up, a light appeared on the road ahead. I couldn't see the vehicle yet, but waved my arms frantically. As it got closer, I could see it was another military Humvee, and it began to slow. I heard one last howl behind me, and the creature disappeared into the forest alongside the road. The truck came to a stop just as I reached it, and several soldiers jumped out. They began questioning why I was there and how I had gotten past the checkpoint. I explained there was no checkpoint and that I was just on my way home. One of the soldiers walked away talking into a radio, and the others began questioning why I waved them down and why I was so obviously distraught. The story just flooded out of my mouth, and throughout, they continued giving each other looks. One even took a few notes. When I was done, one of the soldiers told me that the rock slide in the area must have agitated the few bears around, and that's what I'd seen. I tried explaining that this was not the case at all, but he insisted that I had seen a bear. The man who walked away came back to confirm that no checkpoint was placed on the road, and they offered to give me a ride the rest of the way. I don't think I was really being given a choice, but would have accepted anyway. They didn't say a word on the ride, and where they eventually left me off was a short distance from my house. I know, without any doubt, that it wasn't a bear. Whatever that thing was, well, you can't find it in a zoo, that's for sure. Has anybody else seen anything like this? Every Thanksgiving, I take my family down to New Jersey to visit my grandparents. They're getting older, and I want my two boys to spend as much time as possible with them before the inevitable happens. They live on an immense piece of property not too far from the Wharton State Forest. They aren't overly wealthy or anything. The land's been in my family's hands for over 100 years. My grandfather used to operate a farm on it, but those days are long gone. We were going to stay a total of 5 days. It was just me, my wife, 2 sons, and the grandparents. So it was a quiet Thanksgiving. At first, anyway. My grandparents went to bed super early, so we had more of a Thanksgiving lunch. Around 6 p.m., it had started getting dark, and me and my wife were finishing up the cleaning while my grandparents rested in the living room. Our oldest asked if he could take his 3-year-old brother outside to play a little bit, and we both thought it was fine. About 100 yards away from the back of the house is a small pond, maybe 20 feet wide. It wasn't more than a foot deep, and there were no fish in it. Deer and other critters would often come from the nearby woods to grab a drink from it. We told my son to stay away from it, more so that they didn't accidentally get wet than any real danger of drowning. He's a good kid, smart, responsible, so we didn't have any worries about letting him play outside, That was a mistake. About 20 minutes had passed, and I was at the sink wiping down the last bowl when something made me raise my head and look out the kitchen window. The view from the window encompassed a good portion of the back of the property, including the little pond. The sun was almost down, but I could just make out a large shape, head bent down, over by the pond. I dropped my bowl in the sink and quickly rushed out the back door. Deer are common in the area, and if this thing was as big as I thought it was, then it was probably a buck. They were usually harmless, but I'd seen plenty of YouTube videos of them attacking people and wanted to get my kids back inside. But they were nowhere in sight. The view from the back door isn't as good. My grandmother kept a substantial garden and had some high rose bushes that she was proud of. I quickly walked around them and with a quiet sigh of relief caught sight of my two boys. Only something was definitely wrong. I could see them, about 100 feet away, hunkered down behind the stump of a large tree my grandfather had removed a few years ago. It seemed like my oldest son had his hand clamped around the younger one's mouth, who was starting to squirm and fidget. I started towards them and came around the rose bushes, which gave me a view of the pond. I got a better look at the thing and felt a flood of panic when I realized it wasn't a deer. The thing was the size of a big horse, at least 7 feet high. I could see a pair of thick, curled horns like a ram would have, rising from both sides of its head. It was hard to tell exactly, but I could almost swear it had a set of wings tucked in against the sides of its body. I felt a sense of unexplainable dread wash over me. Something in my mind was screaming for me to flee, but there's no way I would have ever left my kids. Almost immediately, another fear of being seen by this thing came over me, and I dropped to the ground. I low-crawled the rest of the way to where the kids were, and after about halfway, they spotted me. I gave my oldest the signal to stay put, and even the younger one calmed a bit when he saw me. I couldn't see the creature from my vantage point, but I could feel that it was still there. Eventually, I got to them and could see some tension ebb from their panic-stricken faces. I popped my head over the stump and I could see the creature was still there, though something appeared to have drawn its attention away from us. It was looking at the tree line at the back of the property. We had a problem. I couldn't crawl with my youngest son and wouldn't dare let him out of my grasp once I had him. The older one would be fine, but I didn't want to separate. We were going to have to run for it. Saying this now is easy, but in the moment, the idea of this thing seeing us was horrifying, and I was almost paralyzed by terror. But as a father, keeping my children safe overrode anything else I may have felt. I hashed out the path we'd take, and after a few deep breaths, we took off, me carrying the youngest. We'd gone about halfway, and I thought we were going to get away unseen when I heard it. It sounded like a bleating mixed with a screaming person. It was piercing, and I stumbled when I first heard it. My oldest, a few feet ahead, stopped mid-run and covered his ears. I shifted my youngest to one arm and grabbed the other's hand as I passed him. We could see the back door ahead of us, and the sound must have drawn my wife's attention. She opened the door wide-eyed and caught sight of us running toward her. I shouted for her to get back inside, and my voice seemed to aggravate the thing. I could hear a slight gust of wind, like something taking off, and the bleating rose into the air behind us, but closer. We dashed the last few yards to the back door and dove inside the house, landing in a pile. My wife slammed the door closed, and we all sat in complete silence. The noise continued for another few moments, coming from all around the house like it was circling, until it eventually faded away, and then was gone altogether. We were a little banged up from falling into the house, but otherwise okay. My grandparents had snoozed through the entire scenario, and when I asked them what it was, they couldn't really come up with an answer. We stayed one more day and ended up cutting our trip a day short. Part of me felt terrible about leaving my grandparents there with that thing, but on the other hand, they'd lived there for 70 years without incident. Of course, I've heard stories of monsters like the New Jersey Devil, and the thing we saw matched the description, but there's no way that it's actually real and that we encountered it, right?